Excellent. So it's 3 minutes after, so let's get started. I am Lenny Tadelman, one of the co-founders and CEO of Protocols.io, and it's a pleasure to have you join the introduction to Protocols.io and the art of writing methods. I'm going to share my screen. And a few housekeeping things. As you'll see in the agenda in a second, there will be plenty of time for Q&A. However, there are other people from Protocols.io on the call, so you don't have to wait for the Q&A. If you have a question, you can just type it into the chat or the question answer part in Q&A in Zoom. And someone might reply to it if it's easy, just as we're going through, or we'll get to it during the Q&A. You'll see some links also in the chat with a link to these slides and some of the things that we are mentioning up here. This is being recorded, and we will send the recording and the slides to all of the registered folks sometime later today. And just as before the introduction to protocols, just as introduction myself, I am a scientist by training, geneticist, both in experimental and computational biology. And it is my postdoc experience and the struggle with optimizing and correcting a method, microscopy method, that led me to this obsession with creating a central place to share method details. So in this webinar, we'll go over some of the more general things in terms of the motivation behind Protocols.io and what our mission is, some of the basic features, and just orient people. So this is meant for folks that are not power users of Protocols.io. And obviously, we won't have a chance to go through everything that we've been, in terms of functionality that we've been adding to Protocols.io since we launched in 2014. But we do have a lot of regularly scheduled webinars. If you go to protocols.io/webinars, you'll see every month we have a repeating drop-in clinic several times a month where you can just come in and ask questions regarding how you are using Protocols.io. We have more advanced webinars happening every month, and that's the tips and tricks. So take a look at /webinars. If you're more familiar with Protocols.io, you might want to join the more advanced ones. But today we will also, in the second half of this webinar, we'll also go over just some of the best practices, regardless of whether you're using Protocols.io or any other platform, in terms of what are some thoughts that go into writing good protocols, good methods that other people can reproduce. So with that, let's get started. And I have a long collection of tweets complaining about the challenges of reproducing, reading method sections and reproducing what other people have done. One of my favorites is from a postdoc at UC Riverside, Morgan, who said, looking for a protocol in a 97 paper as described in 96, finds 96 paper as described in 87, finds 87 paper, paywall. And that's a very common and very frustrating experience. This is from a biologist. Here is a physicist similarly complaining. Devices were fabricated as previously described, and the original reference is devices were fabricated with conventional methods. So good luck trying to replicate and build on that without contacting the authors. And I have a long thread where I've been collecting things like this over the years. I think it would take us a full 2 hours to go through all of them. We won't, but it's not just the published papers and the method sections of published papers that are challenging. And as part of the sort of the background for why we created Protocols.io, when we're introducing, I also like to talk about the Cancer Biology Reproducibility Project, which was a $1.5 million initiative of the Center for Open Science and Science Exchange. It was a partnership to take 50 papers from high-profile journals in cancer and just independently try to repeat the experiments. And a year or two into it, when the first results were published, there was a lot of media coverage around it. And one of my favorite authors, science writers, Ed Young, writing about it in The Atlantic, included this part about the entire project. The hardest part by far was figuring out exactly what the original labs actually did. Scientific papers come with method sections that theoretically ought to provide recipes for doing the same experiments, but often those experiments are incomplete, missing out important steps, details, or ingredients. In some cases, the recipes aren't described at all. Researchers simply cite an earlier technique. And just a year or two after that, in fact, the entire initiative actually wound down with not 50 papers, but just 18. And a big part of that was the challenge of exactly this, figuring out what precisely was done in the paper. And it's the key part, what I want to underscore here is that it's not just about the paper. The lead authors who were doing the reproducibility project, they contacted the original labs. They were working with the PIs, and the labs themselves couldn't figure out what was the exact protocol that we used. So it's not just the issue, oh, the paper lacks details, we just need to improve how we're publishing. It's also about how we're keeping track of the protocols for ourselves, for our collaborators, inside our academic and industry research teams. So there's turnover, students graduate, employees leave, postdocs find other positions. There is turnover, and reproducibility challenges start long before a paper is published. They start as we're doing the work. Oh, I didn't mean to go to that link. Sorry, just 1 second. I keep doing the same thing. Apologies. And so the mission of Protocols.io is really simple. It's to make it easy to share method details before, during, and after publication. And as you can see, it really is about addressing the two sides of reproducibility, the internal reproducibility in our research teams, and then the external reproducibility for those who publish in terms of what's reported in our research papers. And as I mentioned, we launched in 2014. There is the open access repository site to protocols.io. So when you're sharing papers publicly, and that side at this point has about 11,000 or more public protocols, and everything in the repository is open access. It's free to read. It's free to publish. Our business model is to charge for the internal private collaboration. So that's the part that's limited when you get started. And then after you've created 5 free private protocols, after that point, we either ask you to subscribe or to make some of your protocols public if you're trying to create more than 5 private ones. So that's the business model. And we'll talk a little bit more about some organizations. Some of you who are on this webinar might be from an organization that has a site license or a campus-wide license if it's academic. And we'll mention how to activate that premium if you are at one of those institutions. And I mentioned the mission of protocols.io, but it's not just about, as I said, it's not just about the reproducibility for other people in the published paper. It's not just about what happens in your team after you leave. A big part of what I hope to get across in the introduction is that the goal here is to help you collaborate. It's to save you time. It's to give you more credit for the method development work that you've done. And I think one of my favorite quotes about reproducibility is your most likely collaborator is yourself in 6 months. And so if you get started on Protocols.io early on in your research project, it should save you time all throughout the research cycle and then make publishing easier. So at this point, I'm going to switch out of the slides and actually do 5 or 10 minutes of introduction to Protocols.io Live. So when you come in, just to orient you, when you come in, you'll end up on a landing page. I'm signed in. If you're not, there will be a create account or sign in button. And just as we talk about external and internal reproducibility, the two sides to Protocols.io, the two sides navigating between them are the file manager, that's for your personal protocols, those that are privately shared with you or the ones that you're creating. So the file manager is where your personal work is. And then there is the public side, which is the repository of those 11,000 public protocols that people are sharing and getting credit for. And so once you create an account, you will sign in and you'll be asked to create a workspace. You can have 1 or 15 workspaces as necessary. Most people have 1 or 2, depending on what their collaborations are like, what communities they're joining. And the file manager side, it's just like the file manager in your laptop. You can have folders, subfolders, where you organize your work. And over here on the top right, you can search in 1 or more workspaces across folders and subfolders. On the left-hand side, you can search the 11,000 methods in the public repository. So again, there's the two sides, public and your own private space. So right now I'm looking at one of the public protocols. It has a DOI, it can be cited, and that's in the public side. So every protocol starts out privately, just as in Google Docs. It's yours, visible only to you, unless you create it in a collaborative workspace that's meant to be shared with others. But by default, every protocol is yours. You decide who to share it with, what kinds of permissions to give to them, and I'll show that briefly in a couple of minutes as well. And if and when you're ready, if it's appropriate, you can make it public easily, get a DOI, and get more credit for your method development. So let's take a look at one of the public protocols. As you will notice, they are not just plain text. These are dynamic and interactive. There's a lot of work that has gone into from the Protocols.io side into adding support for really reporting reproducible methods. So we have components and structure inside the editor if you're playing around with it. We've connected with reagent vendors. If you're doing molecular biology, a lot of the reagents that you use, you just type in a catalog number and it will recognize it. So we're trying to record let you record the necessary details for reproducing your work by yourself or others. And you will see that the protocols are dynamic and interactive. So as I scroll through, I can click on any protocol and ask a question that will go to everyone who is using this method and to the author, and you can have these discussions. You decide whether to ask the question privately or publicly if it's on a public protocol. Obviously, if the protocol is private, it's only with those, you're discussing it only with those that you've shared it with. And so here on step 2, you can see there are 5 comments and it's a discussion. The author of the protocol is responding to the questions, and overall there are more than 40 comments on it. The steps, it's not just questions, the interactive part and dynamic part, it's not just questions, but you can add tables, images, you can put in a video that will render right in the step. You can upload it right into the step or drop a link from YouTube. And we highly encourage, I'll talk a little bit more in videos in the second part of the webinar. And as these discussions happen, frequently authors realize that they can clarify, they can add details on what concentration they used or what version of the mouse assembly they analyzed. So not only do you sort of grow a public FAQ on top of the method, but you can come as the author of a technique. You can click create new version. And you can see here, I'm looking at version 2 of the protocol. So even if you've published it and it's fixed and has a DOI and is preserved and archived, you can always come back and click new version, share how you've optimized the protocol or just improve the reporting or add a video. So you don't need to get the protocols perfectly in the beginning. You can always come back and improve them. And there is a compare button. There is a compare button that lets you look at the two versions side by side, and we try to highlight automatically which steps have changed so that there's something different about step 2 and which ones have stayed the same. And not only is there versioning, but one of the key features is that every public or private protocol has a copy fork button, and essentially everything serves as a template. So you can click copy fork, and if you are working with brain samples and I'm working with kidney, there might be slight tweaks about sample preparation. So I can take your protocol, click fork, and it becomes, I get a clone. It becomes a private protocol that I can suddenly edit. Depending on the equipment, on the approaches that we use, on the sample organism that we're working with. So all of the protocols are templates that can be reused, that can be modified, and then again, if and when I'm ready, I can publish my version of the protocol. I can make the fork public, and we try to make sure that we make clear the evolution from the original to the branches and give credit to both the authors of the forks and the original protocol. So you can see this protocol has 65 private forks, and if there were any public ones, they would appear here, and you would see what people are modifying. That same compare functionality works not just between versions, but between forks as well. And about 5 to 10% of the public protocols that we have are computational pipelines, but the vast majority are hands-on field or wet lab methods. And for those, there's also a nice feature that we call Run that allows you to step through, kind of like a cooking checklist app. It allows you to step through the technique as you're performing it. So here I am on step 1. I'm done with this step. I'm moving on to step 2. If there is a timer component, I can start it on my tablet right in the fume hood. And importantly, as I go through the technique, if I change anything, I can make a note, oh, I dropped sample number 17. I can edit at runtime the record of how I performed the experiment. Today I did it at room temperature instead of 35 degrees. And then I can save it as a journal record and come back to it 6 months later to see exactly how I've run this protocol, or export it, print it out, put it in my lab notebook, or drop the PDF into my ELN. And with this functionality, you're not changing the underlying protocol. The important thing to note here, it's a runtime record. So the protocol stays the same, and this just allows you to have a lab notebook-like record of how exactly you perform the experiment on that particular day. Okay, so these are, again, just a reminder, we have drop-in clinics, one-on-one demos. I'll show a slide with those links in a couple of minutes. So I don't have the time on this webinar to go deep into the editor and the different features that we have there. But I do, before I come out of the live demo, I do want to showcase what workspaces look like. And again, I will show an example of a public one. But if you create a workspace for your research team, you can have 10 people, not hundreds of people in it. This is an example of a public one, but you can have a private workspace where it's just you and your colleagues organizing your research team's methods so that you always know what's up to date and who's doing what and can repeat each other's and your own work. But here's an example of a pre-large community workspace. So when you publish a protocol, it doesn't just go into a general repository, but you can affiliate it with relevant workspaces that you're a member of, and a protocol can be in one or more different workspaces. And so here's an example of a workspace of people working on the human cell atlas, single cell research with human samples. And what you'll notice is that there are over 500 members. The publications are all collected in this workspace. So when new people join, they can see what are the most used methods. They have a community of people. Not only can they see all of the 1,500 discussions, but if you join this group, you can ask not just on a protocol, but you can ask a question in general to all of the people that are working with these techniques and are likely to know answers to your questions. You can ask questions on a particular protocol, and those discussions will be visible not just to the author of the protocol, but to the people in the workspace. You can stay up to date when new protocols are added, when new versions come in, you'll get notifications. And so it's a collaborative workspace for method development. And on the file manager side, if I click on the folder, you can come in, you can see what are all the public and private protocols here. There are folders and subfolders organizing in the space. And the last thing that I wanted to show is as you work in workspaces, you can invite collaborators, but for every protocol, there is another way to share. So if you open the protocol up, as I mentioned, you have fine controls just as in Google Docs. You can share by email, you can share with particular users on protocols.io or other workspaces. And if I share with someone by email, I can decide what permissions I'm granting them. Is it view only? Is it to edit? Is it co-administrator? And if it's part of submission of a research paper, in the top right, you can click the share link, and that's a private link. People don't need to create an account on protocols.io. They won't be able to collaborate with you and go into the concurrent editor and make changes. They're not a co-author, but you can give them this link and they will have instant access to your protocol, even if you haven't shared it publicly and gotten a DOI for it. All right, and to finish off the first part, I wanted to say that at this point, there are I think close to 600 journals that recommend protocols.io when you are submitting a paper in the author guidelines. There are more and more funders that are recommending or requiring grantees to share their protocols and specifically recommend protocols.io. And as I mentioned in the beginning, there is an increasing number of companies, organizations, and universities that have site licenses. So I think all of the University of California campuses have a site license for protocols.io and many others. We've started those in 2019 and it's been expanding quickly. So many universities in the US and outside have a site license, and you can find out, I'll come back to this sharing in just a moment, but you can find out if your organization, if you go to protocols.io/institutions, there is a drop down that shows all of the organizations that have a site license. And then from there, if yours is one of them, you can follow the instructions for how to activate your premium. So it's not just unlimited public sharing, but you have unlimited ability to create workspaces and invite collaborators and organize all of your team's unlimited protocols. And for those that are part of a site license, I also want to mention that if you have existing protocols, we have a small editorial team and we provide support for turning them into protocols.io methods. So if you go to protocols.io/we-enter-protocols, you can drop in a PDF or Word file. It will go to one of our editors who will put it in. Another editor will check it to make sure no mistakes were introduced against the original. We'll check it against the original, and then when ready, it will be privately reassigned to you for review, and then either using in your research or making it public. That's completely up to you. And again, if you're at an organization like FDA that has a site license, you'll have, when you activate your premium, you'll get a coupon for submitting existing protocols to us, so you don't have to pay for that service. And before I pause for Q&A, I also wanted to mention for those who are in academia, in terms of the many journals that recommend protocols.io and author guidelines, if you're using protocols.io, it makes writing your paper method section easier. So here's a good example of a PLOS biology paper where the top of the materials and methods section says that the details for media preparation, microbial manipulations are available as a collection on protocols.io. There's a link to a collection of, I think, about 10 protocols that accompany this paper. You'll still write a description, brief description of what methods you used. It's not a complete substitute for the method section, but it makes the paper more reproducible, and it makes it easier for you, instead of trying to condense everything into method section, to say the precise details for the buffers, for the protocols, for the sample processing, for the analysis are available in the following DOI. And then after the paper is published, as a reminder, if you find that you've optimized the method, you can communicate that in a way that's much easier than trying to update a paper just with clicking new version. And when there is a new version, everyone is automatically guided to it. So again, nothing ever disappears on protocols.io. The older version is still available for those who want to see it. But if someone is coming from the paper to an older link, they'll get a pop-up alerting them to the existence of a newer version. And again, for those who are in academia, not only do you get more credit for your method development by sharing methods publicly, and not only do you make papers more reproducible, but as of a year ago, we also have an exciting partnership with the journal +1, where they've created a new article type called Lab Protocol, and they invite submissions from protocols.io if you have a protocol that had significant optimization or novel development in it, they invite submissions and they will peer review the methods. So it's not a research article where they're looking for new groundbreaking results. But if it's a protocol that would be useful to a wider community, you can turn it into a publication and get even more credit for your work, where it becomes a formal paper in +1 that links to your protocol on protocols.io, and we link back to it. And again, it's not just then a PDF paper, but all of the features that we just went over with the templating, the commenting, the ability to version and run makes it a perfect combination of a peer-reviewed paper and a runnable, dynamic, and interactive protocol. So I will pause here before we talk about the best practices of writing protocols, regardless of which platform you use. Feel free to ask questions. If we don't get to a question today, or if you start using protocols.io and questions pop up, as a reminder, we have drop-in clinics, other webinars, and you can always request a one-on-one demo at a time of your convenience. So that's the link here, and you don't have to wait for that monthly drop-in clinic. You can request a one-on-one demo, or just email me or info@protocols.io, and I think have I know we have amazing customer support, so we will respond quickly. Okay, I've been talking a lot, so short pause to see if there are any questions. All right. Again, don't hesitate to ask either in the Q&A or in the chat as we go along, and we'll have a little bit more Q&A time after the second part as well. But before talking about our recommendations for how to write good protocols, what I'd actually like to do, instead of me talking, is ask everyone to get a piece of paper, a blank piece of paper, and a pen or pencil, and in the next 3-4 minutes, try to follow this protocol for drawing something. So I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I want to see how many people can figure out what this is, what these instructions are for. So take a piece of paper, try to follow these steps. This is not a test where you have to show us what came out. If you do guess it, just type in the chat, I got it. If you're hopelessly lost, as I was when I was trying to do this exercise, put into chat, I have no idea. But just try to go through these 9 steps in the next couple of minutes. And this is when we do in-person workshops, when we did them before the pandemic. This was one of my favorite parts of presenting. When we have a little bit more time, we also ask people to draw something and write instructions for it and exchange with someone else in the room to see how close they get to the original. In this case, obviously, we can't do that virtually, so it's a little bit more top-down, where we are asking you to follow our instructions. One of my relatives, when they were following through this, got really frustrated and threw the notepad across the room saying these instructions are horrible. I don't think they're horrible, as you'll see, but they're not perfect, and that really is the heart of this exercise. But please don't get frustrated. Don't throw things. It's not you. It's imperfect instructions. So if you got it, type into the chat. I know what it is. Don't say what it is, not to ruin it for others. We'll do another 1 or 2 minutes. And if you are at step 9 and it doesn't look like anything and you're confused, just say confused. Okay, so let's give it another 30 seconds. Anyone think they figured it out? Okay, so hopefully you're not too frustrated. I don't see anyone saying that they figured it out. And again, that's the point of this exercise. These are imperfect instructions. So here are from the in-person times when we run it. We've taken pictures of some of the entries that we've gotten, and as imperfect as they are, you can probably start to guess that this is SpongeBob. So this is the original that the step-by-step instructions are based on. But the reason I love this exercise is that when you look at what people are doing, you really quickly figure out, oh, I can make the instructions more precise. You can see a lot of people get the nose wrong. The mouth itself, half the time it's in the right direction, half the time it's a very sad frown instead of a smile. So as you see what happens when people follow the protocol, you get a very clear picture of how to improve the instructions. And the reason we love this exercise is because it highlights a lot of the things that are critical for writing good protocols, keeping in mind important critical things to keep in mind as you're writing protocols. And one of the most important ones is that the platform itself is a tool, but the thought and the care that goes into creating that recipe is what matters most, right? So just because you use protocols.io doesn't mean that what you shared is reproducible. If you didn't really think about, would someone who doesn't know me, who hasn't watched me do it, would someone be able to follow? Do I take too many things for granted? And so whether you're using Google Docs or protocols.io, probably the most important part is the care that you take into crafting the protocol itself. And we'll go through what are some of the most important things to keep in mind next. And going back to this exercise, I mentioned that as you look at what comes out when people try to follow the instructions, you can easily spot what parts of the instructions need to be improved. And that is a lesson that's almost as important as what I shared here. Don't try to write a perfect protocol. Get started, write it, and try to get feedback, try to show it to others. But then if you're publishing a paper, as people start working with this, you will get comments, you'll get feedback. And so if you digitize the methods, it makes it easy to share with others. And importantly, which platform you're using to digitize, because methods are constantly evolving, not just with the techniques, but with the clarity of what we're reporting, because you see people trying to reproduce SpongeBob or your experiment and failing, you will want to clarify very frequently. And so from that perspective, choose the tools for digitizing your protocols that allow you to easily version. There are ELNs that have good support for versioning of your protocols. Google Docs is great at versioning. We keep a history of all of the changes that were made, and I showed you the compare button. You can torture Microsoft Word into the versioning, but it's not trivial. So we usually don't recommend that, but whatever you're using, digitize. Don't aim for perfection. Aim for something reasonable to start with, and then expect that you'll improve it over time. And when you write a protocol, try to think of it actually as a mini paper, not because you're submitting it necessarily to +1 lab protocols, but think of giving it an abstract. Think of putting in as much detail as you can, but into the right places. So that's another thing that I'll mention. So on protocols.io, the sections of a protocol, when I was demoing, you might have noticed, we do require an abstract if you're making something public. And then we have steps, guidelines, warnings, materials. And abstracts really help people if you're making something public for discoverability, for people learning that your technique is in protocols.io. They make a big difference. And even within your research group, if you have 30, 40 methods, some older versions, some newer ones, putting in an abstract saves you and your colleagues a lot of time in trying to figure out, is this the protocol that I'm looking for, without having to open it and scroll through all of the steps and figure out if it's the right one. So don't try to save 4 or 5 minutes on the abstract. That is one of the key parts of sharing protocols. And the details, I said, try to include as much detail as possible, descriptions and videos particularly. You don't need a huge camera crew to come in and shoot a Spielberg-like movie. You have iPhones and Samsung smartphones in the lab. It is very easy to take a 10-second, 60-second video to show people exactly how you do something instead of 10 sentences. And when you're sharing publicly, keep in mind that there is a global audience. Most people are not native English speakers in this world. And when you do include images and videos, they're natural localizers. No one can pay to translate a given protocol into all of the languages that people use, but videos and images naturally do that. So we can't recommend enough using that, again, regardless of which platform you're sharing on. And a note about the details that I think is important, when you look at the different sections of the protocol in here, think about where the details go. And I like to talk about 2 groups of users of a protocol. One is yourself and people like you who are using and running through the protocol every day. And the other one is a new member of the team, a rotation student that comes in, a new employee in your biotech. And they need the introduction, they need the background, they need more explanation, but there is a balance in terms of how much you include in the steps themselves. So when you write a protocol, try to think of the first-time user and try to put the basic information that you read the first time you're trying to do the technique or the first couple of times. Try to put that into the guidelines or warnings. The steps themselves include the necessary details, but keep them succinct so that you can run through very crisp instructions yourself if you're doing this over and over without too many words, without too many sentences in each of the steps. So think of the two different audiences, right? The expert user and the first-time user. Do put in as much detail as you can, but pay attention to where those details go. Don't just, the method sections unfortunately have past tense, everything condensed into paragraph forms. That's not what a protocol looks like. That's why I recommend Protocols.io and they're so partial to it. So don't learn from method sections and the condensed paragraph form. Have step-by-step instructions, use active voice in a protocol instead of the past tense that research papers typically require. And both for private and public protocols, if you're collaborating with many people, if you're part of a workspace with lots of protocols or are in a member of multiple workspaces, just like the abstract, there is in the editor on Protocols.io, there is a keyword section. So put in the synonyms, PCR, polymerase chain reaction, put in the synonyms so that when you're searching, when others are searching through the repository, or when you're searching for your own protocols or collaborators protocols, they will be easy to find, not just the two words that are in the title. So don't miss the keyword section. And of course, hints, tips, tricks. If you've published the protocol and then don't necessarily want to create a new version, but you have hints, use the comment functionality. Click on a step, add a note to it so it's on the margins. You can still run through the step-by-step crisp instructions, but for the first-time reader or an occasional user, those side note reminders can be really, really helpful to avoid mistakes. And going back to our SpongeBob exercise, you're writing a protocol, you're using it every day for a year or more. It will seem intuitive, it will seem clear to you, but short of submitting it for peer review as part of a paper, just share it with other colleagues, even if they're not running through your protocol because it takes a month or a week and they have their own projects. Share it with colleagues, see if they can read through and if it's clear, if they would get stuck on any steps, so that before you make it public, before you submit it as part of a paper or as a separate paper, get feedback on which steps need more detail or a little bit more care. We do that with papers before we submit them into journals. We try to get someone to read. Same thing with the protocol. Have someone scan through and tell you, "Ooh, you're missing the concentration here. I don't know where you ordered the antibody. What version of the software did you use?" Really quick, really helpful feedback. And a really common sense thing that sometimes people miss is when you're editing, don't just click publish when you're done with the protocol. Click the view button in protocols.io and just look through it and see, are the tables formatted how I want them to be? Are there extra breaks? Does it look reasonable? So come out of the edit mode and take a look and in the view mode at how your protocol looks. Apologies for jumping around. And here's a sort of summary of the things that we've just gone over. So you'll have the link to the slides, and if you're writing a new protocol, just take a quick look at this checklist and make sure that you've thought about the what's inside my protocol, not just where am I sharing it. And with that, I will stop and see if there are more questions. And thank you, Emma at Protocols.io, for sharing the links in the chat. So those are some of the things we were going over. And as I said, we will share the link to these slides. Very often people will run a version of this talk for their lab, for their journal club. Please feel free to take the slides, use them, reuse them, build on them, just like Protocols.io itself is meant, every protocol is meant to be a template. Our presentations are templates for you to talk to your colleagues about method development. Not specific, not necessarily just Protocols.io, but in general, feel free to reuse any of the content with your colleagues, and of course to share this webinar as well. All right, and another link from Emma about the protocol entry service. And I think we can probably stop the recording here. We're almost at the hour, and I'll hang around for another couple of minutes to see if there are any other questions. I should say that one question we do frequently get that I didn't mention today is along the lines of what happens if you go bankrupt. If I take all this time as a scientist to learn your platform and start sharing my protocols, what guarantees are there that you'll be around in 2 years? And I think it's encouraging that we've been around since 2014 and have not gone bankrupt and survived the pandemic. And we were lucky to have really good support from a number of funders, Jen Zuckerberg Initiative and Gordon Betty Moore Foundation. Our revenue is growing, so we're on the right path to sustainability. But we don't take any of that for granted. And you can see in the FAQ, we actually do a lot to preserve and mirror all of the public protocols. We make export of all of your protocols and records really easy. With a click of a button, you can send everything that you have to Google Drive or Center for Open Science's OSF and other cloud tools, or just download everything to your computer. And that's something we always recommend, regardless of which ELN or cloud tool you're using. And this year, we're also in the process of setting up an additional mirror. Right now, we send every public protocol, we send a PDF of it to the CLOCKS repository that by pretty much all biomedical publishers that I can think of use, so that if something were to happen to us, the DOIs will still resolve and all of the public content is there. We also mirror, thanks to the Internet Archive, we mirror with their service the PDFs, but this year we're also setting up a fuller mirror hosted by the Chen Zuckerberg Initiative. We're setting up a bigger mirror so that it's not just the PDFs, but the video content, comments, and the evolving dynamic nature of protocols can be captured in the mirror, not just a snapshot of the original PDF. So those are some of the steps we go through to make sure that there is longevity, preservation, and that in 30 years people can still access all of the content and repeat some of the experiments, although I'm sure most of the methods will be different by then. All right, well, if you have any other questions, feel free to get in touch with info@protocols.io or with Lenny at protocols.io. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining.